Thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. At dawn on the 7th of September 1628, the man in the lookout spots sail on the horizon. All hands rush on deck, orders resound in the air, weapons are readied. The Spanish treasure fleet, finally, is within their grasp. Piet Hein, the greatest privateer of the Netherlands, the sea wolf of the Dutch Republic, had been waiting for these ships for over a month. The following night, he would celebrate the greatest success of his career. He would rob the hated Spanish of one of their most precious goods, the invaluable treasure fleet from the New World. Piet Hein was far from being the first who targeted the Spanish treasure fleet. On the contrary, this famed fleet was the ultimate target of all enemies of Spain on the open oceans. Each year, two fleets left from Seville or Cadiz with European goods for the Americas. After a stop in the Canary Islands, they crossed the Atlantic Ocean and parted ways in the Caribbean. The Flota de Tierra Firme sailed to Panama and Cartagena, gathering valuables from this region, most importantly silver, while the Flota de Nueva España was bound for Veracruz in Mexico, where it was loaded with silver and the precious red dial cochineal. With their valuable cargo, the two fleets united in Havana before they'd sail home. The historian Robert Stradling points out that the empire depended on these annual shipments of silver and other goods from the New World to finance its wars in the Old World, especially after 1627, when King Philip IV had to declare national bankruptcy. This made it an even more appealing target to the Dutch West India Company, on whose behalf Piet Hein was sailing. After 1621, the Spanish imposed a trade embargo on the Republic, tried to restrict the Dutch trade on sea, and surrounded the country with a belt of fortifications. But successfully raiding the Spanish New World treasure fleet could single-handedly finance a Dutch counterattack and break the Spanish stranglehold. But that was not the only reason why Piet Hein was determined to capture the silver fleet of 1628. He also had a personal matter to settle with the Spanish. Peter Petersen Heyn, as his full name reads, was born the son of a simple seafarer in the Dutch town of Delfshaven in November of 1577. From an early age, he took to the sea and learned the ins and outs of seafaring from his father. But in 1598, he and his father were both taken prisoner by the Spanish. According to the historian Klaus Rattelband, this experience was formative for Piet, who was condemned to serve as a galley slave in the fleet of the famous general Ambrogio Spinola. For 4 endless years, he toiled in the cramped hold of a ship, moving heavy oars, until he was finally freed in a prisoner exchange. Only 1 year later, he was taken prisoner by the Spanish again, this time in Cuba. When he was finally released after another 3 years, the Spaniards were no longer just his country's, but also his personal enemies. One of his tormentors he remembered particularly well, Juan de Benavides Bazan. The two men were to cross paths again at a very crucial moment in Hein's life. From 1607 to 1612, Heyn served in the Dutch East India Company and took part in the expedition to the Moluccas. He quickly rose to the rank of captain and upon his return married a wealthy widow. The two settled in Rotterdam, where Heyn established himself as a sailing merchant and soon became a respected citizen and was even elected alderman in 1622. By now, Piet Hein had become a self-made man. But his ambitions, his hatred for the Spanish, and his longing for the salty water soon drove him out of his made nest. In 1623, he entered the service of the Dutch West India Company as a vice admiral and sailed to Brazil with about 26 ships to conquer some of the colonies there. They arrived at their first target, the city of Salvador in modern-day Bahia, on the 8th of May 1624. According to the historian Sir Charles Ralph Boxer, Heyn was responsible to a large part for the successful conquest of the town. He commanded the landing craft and climbed over the walls of the city at the head of his men. Although the rest of the expedition was less successful, it scored Heyn a new nickname, the Sea Terror of Delfshaven. 2 years later, now as admiral, Heyn set out for the Atlantic again, this time with the mission to capture enemy ships. He did so with great success. His fleet sailed from Sierra Leone to Bahia, where he twice plundered the Bay of All Saints near Salvador, which the Spanish and Portuguese had meanwhile reconquered. Venturing on, they captured one ship after another and even discovered the Flota de Tierra Firme between Florida and Cuba. Although Heyn was itching to attack, he had to let the heavily laden silver ships go. It would have been insane to attack the convoy of 40 sail with his 14 ships. When Heyn returned to the Netherlands in summer of 1627, his ships were filled to the brim with valuable goods, especially sugar, tobacco, and hides. His booty was so rich that the Dutch West India Company could hardly refuse him any wish. And there was something to fulfill all his wishes at once: the task of capturing next year's treasure fleet. The odds were better than ever. Because of the empty coffers, the Spanish crown was struggling to mobilize enough ships to transport the silver to the Old World, and was thus forced to reduce the number of vessels escorting the fleet. The West India Company granted Heyn's wish, and made him admiral of a fleet of 39 ships and almost 4,000 men. On the 20th of May 1628, the heavily armed ships left the safe waters of the Rede van Texel. Heyn had prepared the expedition thoroughly, spreading rumors that the fleet's destination would again be Brazil or Asia. He made this deception plausible by sailing his ship south in plain sight for 1 day, before ordering a sharp change of course and turning the squadron westward. His plan worked. About 3 weeks later, the Dutch ships reached the island of St. Vincent unnoticed and replenished their fresh water and fruit. But then Heyn made a mistake. During a second stop on La Blanquilla Island off the Venezuelan coast, where the sailors were hunting goats and pigs, a ship's boy got lost in the forest and had to be left behind on the island after a futile search operation. This was fatal, because a Spanish ship picked up the boy shortly after. Now the Spaniards knew that the Dutch fleet was looking for their silver and hurriedly notified the Flota de Tierra Firme in Cartagena de Indias, which consequently remained anchored in its safe haven. The plan had been revealed. Piet Hein, unsuspectingly, sailed to the Cape San Antonio, the westernmost point of Cuba, as planned, and began to look for the treasure fleets between the island and Florida. He planned to intercept them on their way to Havana, where they were to meet before setting sail for Spain jointly. However, weather and water put a second spoke in Heyn's wheel. The wind died and the current drove his ships towards Havana, where they passed on the 22nd of August. The governor of Havana knew that Heyn was looking for the treasure fleet and sent out 9 small ships to warn the second fleet, the Flota de Nueva España, which had left Veracruz on the 8th of August. But none of them reached the fleet. On the contrary, one of them was captured by Heyn. Because of this, Heyn knew that the enemy was aware of his presence. But he also knew that he had not missed the second fleet, and there was still hope. And more than that, during the interrogation, a name was mentioned that was deeply etched on Heyn's memory: Juan de Benavides Bazan. He was the commander of the Flota de Nueva España. Quite unexpectedly, Heyn was given the chance to take revenge not only on Spain, but also on his personal arch-enemy. Benavides had no idea what was in store for him. He had turned out to be a corrupt courtier who completely ignored the designated schedule and risked the silver vital for Spain to line his own pockets. He used his king's ships to trade in contraband and only set out to meet the Flota de Tierra Firme in Havana when King Philip IV personally admonished him to finally return to Spain. He then loaded the ships to the brim one last time and had even some of the gun stations converted into cabins to accommodate paying passengers. On top of that, his fleet was first caught in a violent storm and then set in a calm in late August. The same current that let the Dutch privateers drift off course was now dragging his ships into their arms. When the wind finally freshened and most of the fleet had found together, they set sail toward Havana. Days passed since Heyn's men had caught the messenger ship. They were bobbing up and down at the height of Matanzas Bay. Almost all hope was lost when finally a Spanish straggler coming from the west sailed between them in the morning of the 7th of September. When the Spanish captain, believing he had found his countryman, revealed himself as being Spanish, the Dutch sailors shouted in cheer, "Zin speken, zin speken," which roughly means something like "they are gammons, which was their derogatory term for the Spanish and Portuguese. After they had captured the ship, the Dutch questioned their prisoners, who soon reported that the rest of the fleet was close. And indeed, as dusk was falling, the men in the outlooks spotted 12 Spanish ships on the horizon to the north, and another 6 closer to the shore, including the 4 galleons that were transporting the silver. After quickly seizing some smaller merchant ships nearby, Heyn divided his fleet in order to catch the silver ships. He himself wanted to cut off the way to Havana, while his Vice Admiral Jost Bankert was to sail in their rear. Swiftly, the sailors brought every piece of sail to wind, and the race began. Benavides, who had been watching these events closely, urged his men to hurry as well, hoping to slip through to Havana. But soon he realized he was going to lose the race. For that reason, he turned south to seek shelter in the Bay of Matanzas. A captured navigator had told him that the wind usually shifted at sunset and would thus prevent Piet Hein from following the Spanish ships into the bay. This, Benavides hoped, would bring him time to bring ashore and secure the silver. But when the ships were level with the head of the bay, a jolt went through Benavides' flagship, the Santa Ana Maria. And before anyone could react, all 6 Spanish ships had run aground. It seems the navigator did not know the region all too well, after all. The wind did not shift either. To the contrary, a fresh breeze blew inland until 10 or 11 o'clock, allowing Piet Hein to follow the Spanish on their heels. This completed Benavides' disaster. His ships lay crosswise on the sandbars, blocking each other's line of fire, while the Dutch were slowly coming closer. Now it became apparent that Benavides was not a good leader at all. His men prepared explosives in order to blow up their ships to prevent the silver from falling into the hands of the enemy. But they waited for Benavides' orders in vain. Panic spread among the leaderless passengers and crew. Everyone stuffed their pockets with whatever treasures they could get their hands on and rushed to the dinghies to flee. Some even jumped off the ships to swim ashore. But nobody thought of lighting the fuses, let alone defending the ships. Meanwhile, night had fallen and nothing but the shimmering moon lighted the scene. Nevertheless, it was bright enough for the men of the Dutch West India Company to see what was going on. They immediately opened fire on the dinghies and those fleeing from the ship, while some of their own rowed to the Spanish ships. Heyn was among the first to board the closest ship, the Santa Gertrudis. The few remaining Spanish barely put up any resistance and immediately laid down their weapons when the Dutch offered buena guerra, that is, to treat them well if they surrendered unconditionally. Heyn breathed a sigh of relief. It was done. The Silver Fleet was his. The only drop of bitterness was that Benavides had escaped. Although the faithless admiral later claimed that he had only disembarked when one of his men urged him to organize resistance on the beach, several eyewitness accounts prove that he was among the first to take flight. The booty was so massive it took the men of the West India Company a full week to count it and move it to the Dutch ships. There was silver, gold, hides and cochineal and much more. When they were finally done, Heyn ordered to burn all but 5 of the captured ships and maroon most of the prisoners with sufficient supplies to get to the next plantation. On the 17th of September, Piet Hein's fleet raised the anchors. The Dutch and the treasures were bound homeward. After a long and perilous voyage, the fleet reached the Dutch port of Hellevoetsluis on the 10th of January. Piet Hein returned home a hero. In every town he passed through on his way to Amsterdam, he was welcomed like a king. Frederick Hendrik of Orange, the stadtholder of the Netherlands, personally organized a banquet in his honors. Everyone understood what a blow Heyn had dealt to the Spanish Empire in a moment when the 30 Years' War was going badly for the Protestant allies, and the 80 Years' War of the Dutch themselves had been going just as badly. But he not only humiliated Spain in front of the world, but also had captured an enormous sum. In total, the Silver Fleet was worth about 11.5 million guilders, which roughly translates to a purchasing power of $500 million. This was a harsh blow to the Spanish war chest, ruined the creditworthiness of the empire, and washed enough wealth into the pockets of the Republic, so that the Dutch were now able to launch their long-planned counterattack. It was in part this money that made possible the siege of 's-Hertogenbosch, the strongest fortress of the Spanish encirclement. This was the first blow to break the Spanish stranglehold on the Dutch Republic. Piet Hein succeeded. He captured the treasure fleet. He was the most popular man in the Republic, and he paid the Spanish back. But Heyn could not bask in his glory for long. When on the 17th of June 1628, he was on a campaign against the Dunkirker privateers in the Straits of Dover, who were in the service of Spain and a constant threat to the Republic's merchant ships, an 8-pound cannonball shattered his torso. Heyn died instantly. He subsequently became a national hero and has since occupied a place in the Dutch Hall of Fame comparable to that of Sir Francis Drake in England. And although he didn't live long enough to see it himself, his victory also scored him the revenge on his opponent, Don Juan de Benavides Bazan, because he had lost the treasure fleet. He was beheaded on charge of high treason in Seville 5 years later. We want to build upon the success of our channel and are therefore working on a website for our fans. We're building it with the help of today's sponsor, Squarespace, a powerful online platform from which to create your own website. Squarespace is for everybody who wants to build a presence on the internet for any sort of business. Let me give you 3 reasons why to choose Squarespace. Firstly, you can choose any of their professional designs to make your website look exactly how you want it, which is also very easy to do. Secondly, their integrated traffic overview feature helps tracking trends and page visits, which helps you better optimize your content. Finally, Squarespace's email campaign tools enable you to create engaging and professional emails very easily, to reach your audience more efficiently and on a more personal level. Go to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/SandRhoman to save 10% of your first purchase of a website or domain.